Our next speaker is Andrew Gallimore, who's a lecturer in biology, and he spends his spare time thinking about consciousness and psychedelic drugs. Parenthetically, I rode the bus up here with him, and I asked him if he had samples for the audience and make this experiential, and unfortunately he said no. The topic of his title, or the topic of his talk, is Building Alien Worlds, the Neuropharmacological and Evolutionary Implications of the DMT Flesh.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm just going to microphone down. Okay, I'm conscious about time, so dive straight into this. Friends, right here and now, one quantum away, there is raging a universe of active intelligence that is transhuman, hyperdimensional, and extremely alien. Terence McKenna, who spoke those words, wrote and spoke extensively about DMT. He can certainly be credited with popularizing at least the idea of smoking DMT, although very few people have dared, even after listening to him, rave about it. He certainly inspired me to embark on what I can only imagine will be a lifelong fascination with this truly astonishing molecule. The idea that you can take 2 or 3 lungfuls of a simple molecule like DMT and within 30 seconds be transported to what appears to be a fully autonomous hyper-technological alien reality is exciting. And I really don't believe that anybody who's serious about consciousness and serious about understanding the nature of reality needs to take DMT. As Terence McKenna would say, if you've got 10 minutes of your time, I can show you. Okay, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the effects of DMT. There are plenty of books available. Briefly, the DMT flash is normally smoked. The onset is extremely rapid and extremely intense. Fortunately, it doesn't last that long, only a few minutes. But the consensus world, if you like, is very rapidly and completely replaced by this extremely bizarre, hyper-technological alien reality. And normally, alien entities, or certain entities, are normally present and often infest this space. What's particularly noticeable is that everybody, given a high enough dose, seems to go to the same place. I'll just give one or two examples. This is from Rick Strassman's book, DMT, the Spirit Molecule. A space station below me and to my right. Presences were guiding me to a platform. I was also aware of many entities inside the space station, automatons, android-like creatures that looked like a cross between crash test dummies and Empire troops for Star Wars, except they were living beings, not robots. They were doing some sort of routine technological work and paid little attention to me. And this kind of thing comes up again and again. And the idea that normally comes across is that these are highly advanced, highly intelligent entities, vastly more capable than us. Often they actively try to interact with the tripper as well, and some people describe them as kind of elf-like, and being an elf myself, I'm particularly interested in this aspect of the experience. Often they kind of welcome, lights start flashing, and they kind of welcome and then say goodbye at the end and tell them they love them and all these kind of things. It's remarkable, really. So Terence McKenna was bold enough to say that given a high enough dose, you get elves. Everybody gets elves, and this is truly, truly remarkable. So what I'd like to do is give a few new ideas of how DMT, first of all, is able to switch the brain very rapidly from this consensus reality into this bizarre alien reality, and why DMT is so special and being unique in being able to do that. So first we need to be clear that if a world appears to consciousness, it's built by the brain. Now I'm not going to say anything about the nature of the external world at all, but if a world is to be, so the scene to appear to consciousness, it must be built by the brain. If the brain can't construct a world, then you can't see a world, you can't experience a world. So it's easy to get dragged into kind of questions about, is the DMT world real or is it built by the brain? But these are not independent. These are not independent. I will give you a better question to ask later. So to understand how the brain constructs, builds the DMT reality, which it must do if it's to appear to consciousness, we should first probably look at how the brain builds consensus reality. And the key to that really lies within the cortex, or the cortex of the brain, but also the thalamus, this deep subcortical structure, is highly interconnected. So I'll refer to this as the thalamocortical system. Now, the thalamocortical system builds worlds using functional segregation and integration. Now, the best way to understand this is to break the cortex up into a columnar structure, into an array of columns. And this is actually the way that neuroscience regards the cortical columns as being the basic unit of functional segregation. Here we can see the columns from the side showing the layers of the cortex. I call them cortical columns, but really they're thalamocortical columns because each specific region of the cortex, each cortical column, is reciprocally connected to a specific region of the thalamus. There are also these non-specific interactions, connections, that allow all of these functionally segregated thalamocortical columns to be unified, to form a unified structure which allows for a unified world. So to explain how this works, first I'll take an extremely simple world, probably the most simple world you can imagine. I'll take a simple red square moving in a particular direction. Now this is the perceived visual object, but it has a cortical representation. So we need to understand how does the brain build that world? Well, the different features of the object are represented or built using different components of the cortex. So motion, colour, form, texture, etc., all represented by different functionally specific columns. They're also unified by the connectivity between them. So this is kind of the pattern, the activation pattern that represents this object, this moving red square. Now we can extrapolate this to how the brain builds highly complex realities that we, of course, we are all aware of right now. When you've only got a few columns, as illustrated here, you can only build a limited number of worlds with a limited number of features. But when you've got an extremely complicated, enormous array of thalamocortical columns, you can build worlds with practically limitless complexity. And the world that is built is highly informative because you've got this, billions of these functionally distinct thalamocortical columns, but also unified because all of the thalamocortical columns are integrated by these patterns of connectivity. Now, the consensus world is very stable, it's very predictable. So, all possible patterns of activation of the thalamocortical columns are not normally accessible. And the reason is because connectivity, so the patterns of connection between the thalamocortical columns, determines what we call the intrinsic activity, the ongoing patterns of activation of the brain, of the thalamocortical system. So this connectivity determines the repertoire, if you like, of thalamocortical states and patterns of activation that can be adopted. So this creates a very stable, predictable world that we're all very, very familiar with. So this kind of begs the question, how did the thalamocortical system learn to build this world? And the best guess we have at the moment is that over time, so I mean evolution, development and experience, sensory data or patterns of sensory data from the external world was sampled by the thalamocortical system, and this strengthens and weakens certain connections. The connections I've shown here suggest kind of an all or nothing, either it's there or it's not. This is not true. There are degrees of connectivity. There are weak connections, strong connections, excitatory and inhibitory connections. It's trying to show the kind of patterns of connectivity. So over time, the brain, the thalamocortical system develops this set of connectivities that means that the intrinsic activity, in other words, the patterns of activation that are ongoing in the thalamocortical system, generate this world as a default state. And that's very important. And in fact, the intrinsic activity of the thalamocortical system dominates the construction of your world. A very small amount of information is actually used to build the world that you see at the moment. This is what we call extrinsic information, extrinsic data. So this pattern of sensory data is it modulates ongoing intrinsic activity of the thalamocortical system, or to put it another way, is matched to ongoing activity of the thalamocortical system. So the built world, the consensus world, is a default state of the brain, modulated but not created by extrinsic sensory data. We know this, of course, because if you go to sleep at night, the primary sensory areas of the brain that normally receive the extrinsic sensory data are deactivated. The thalamus, or certainly the relay portions of the thalamus, are deactivated. And yet the brain is perfectly capable of constructing a world in exactly the same way as it does during waking. And in fact, REM sleep and waking are functionally equivalent, and this has been shown numerous times. So the brain builds worlds during dreaming in exactly the same way as it does when it's awake. The difference is when you're awake, the intrinsic activity of the thalamocortical system is modulated by extrinsic sensory data. That is not the case during dreaming, as far as we know. So really the question about DMT is not, is it built by the brain? It must be. All worlds that you perceive are built by your brain. They're built using intrinsic activity of the thalamocortical system. The waking world, we know, is modulated by extrinsic sensory data. The dream world isn't, apparently. So the question really is not, is the DMT world real, but is it modulated by extrinsic sensory data? And the answer to that is we don't know. But if the brain is capable of building the DMT world, which is really remarkable in itself, we know that the brain learned to build the consensus world, then did the brain learn to build the DMT world? And I would suggest that it must have done. Now to explain this, we need to look a little bit more at the thalamocortical system. In fact, we'll look at this is a thalamocortical loop, or a highly simplified representation. In the thalamocortical loop, it generates these gamma oscillations, which allows these cortical columns not only to be sort of simultaneously activated, but also to be synchronized, so they're oscillating synchronously. Now, I'm going to direct attention to these apical dendrites of the cortical pyramidal neuron, because they contain two really important serotonin receptors. The 5-HT by the way, is serotonin, 5-hydroxytryptamine. The 5-HT1A and the 5-HT2A. Now, the 1A receptor tends to lower the excitability of the pyramidal neurons, and thus the thalamocortical loops, and thus the cortex as a whole, and also inhibits gamma oscillations. The 2A receptor does the opposite. It depolarizes the neuron, it makes it more likely to fire, i.e. increases excitability, and it also promotes gamma oscillations in these thalamocortical loops. Now, normally serotonin binds to both, and so it actually tunes the pyramidal neurons, tunes the thalamocortical system to a certain level of excitability. And what classical psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, DMT in fact do, is they're able to selectively bind to 5-HT2A, and so they tune the pyramidal neurons to different degrees, depending on the drug, towards excitation, towards the promotion of gamma oscillations. Now, the effect of that overall is, first of all, an increased sensitivity to incoming sensory data, but also enhanced gamma oscillations in these thalamocortical loops. And the result are these novel activation patterns. So normally, the world is stable, it's predictable because of these connectivities that have developed through evolution, development, and experience. But what a psychedelic drug does, by activating all of the cortical columns and bringing them close to firing and promoting gamma oscillations, it promotes, it's sort of a democratization really of these thalamocortical columns, or a repotentiation, if you like, of the thalamocortical system, where these novel activation patterns are possible. Columns that wouldn't normally become involved in the thalamocortical state do so, and this is really the basis of the psychedelic experience. But DMT is very different. It doesn't seem to do this. It doesn't give an unpredictable, fluid representation of the world, which is what psychedelic drugs do. They change the world from being stable and predictable to be fluid and unpredictable, really. DMT seems to shift the thalamocortical system into generating a completely different but highly regular pattern of intrinsic activity that builds a highly crystalline, clear, stable other world. So it's a completely different mode of action to regular psychedelic drugs, if you like. So, if the brain is able to do this, it suggests it learned to do it. It suggests that the intrinsic activity is based on connectivities that were developed. And we can assume, perhaps, that the brain learned to build the alien world in the same way it learned to build the consensus world. And there's no reason why it wouldn't do so. So, patterns of sensory data from an alien reality, if you like, over time, i.e. evolution, development, and experience, would generate these connectivities which would build the alien world as a default. Now, of course, that requires that the brain learned somehow to construct two different realities. Well, how would that work? Well, one idea is what I call parallel neural evolution. So if the brain was able to cycle between primarily serotonin secretion and primarily DMT secretion, so this is an ancestral function of DMT, I believe. I don't believe this happens currently. Serotonin is secreted during the day, and this is currently what serotonin does, and it locks the brain, if you like, into constructing consensus reality. But also it means that the consensus world, or the brain's ability to build the consensus world, evolves during the day. Whereas, for example, at night time, I suggest that probably REM sleep, its modern form of REM sleep, is probably not its original function. But when DMT secretion is ramped up and serotonin drops down, serotonin, by the way, does still drop down during REM sleep, but DMT is not ramped up, then that would mean that during the evening, or at night when you're also dreaming, in fact, the old original ancestral dream state would have been the time when the evolution of the brain's ability to construct the alien world, or the DMT world, whatever you want to call it, would develop. And so basically the brain has two parallel sets of connectivities. What we're talking about here is some highly complex, finely balanced patterns of connectivity. And I think it's extremely important, the state of excitation of the pyramidal neurons that are when these connectivities are developed. And so when the connectivities that generate the consensus world as a default were developed, serotonin was present, so the pyramidal neurons were at a particular excitation state. And we know, of course, that if you shift that by giving LSD or psilocybin, for example, the connectivities become jumbled, or you get a much more fluid, and unstable and unpredictable state. Whereas when, of course, DMT was present when the ability to construct, or the connectivities that construct the DMT reality were developed, then when you replace DMT into the brain, or through smoking it, what you're doing effectively is shifting the excitability of the pyramidal neurons to precisely where they were when those original connectivities were developed. And so we have a clear neurological explanation of why DMT and DMT alone is able to shift the brain into constructing two completely different realities. It's not, it's quite straightforward. Here we've got a simple network of excitatory, strong, weak interactions and inhibitory. And by changing the excitability of the whole system, you will change which networks dominate. And this is how I believe DMT works in the brain. So, although DMT is no longer secreted in psychedelic concentrations by the brain, when DMT replaces serotonin, when you smoke it in a high dose, the brain shifts from constructing the consensus world as a default, and the brain shifts from receiving consensus sensory data, so to speak, as a default. It rapidly shifts completely into constructing this alien reality as a default, and possibly also allows sensory data from this reality to modulate the intrinsic activity of the brain, which you wouldn't be able to do when serotonin was present. So is there any evidence for this? Well, one only really has to look at DMT to see that it really does behave like an endogenous neuromodulator. Structurally, here we've got the structure of dimethyltryptamine. It's very similar to serotonin. It's the simplest of the psychedelic drugs. As a chemical pharmacologist looking at this drug, it's really unimpressive. It's basically got no chemical functionality of any note, really. Even the amine here, even the nitrogen, is masked by these kind of bulky methyl groups. So it's two steps from tryptophan, as is serotonin. So it's a very simple molecule, again, as you would expect for an endogenous neuromodulator. It's metabolized at about the same rate you'd expect for an endogenous neuromodulator, unlike other tryptamine psychedelics such as psilocybin or mescaline, metabolized within minutes. There's no tolerance. Again, this is completely unlike psilocybin or LSD or mescaline. Rick Strassman showed this. Rick Strassman did the first studies in humans that were licensed, I think got funding from the NIH, and showed that you can have repeated doses of this drug and it doesn't exhibit any kind of tolerance effect. You get the same response every time. And again, you'd expect this for an endogenous neuromodulator. It's a substrate for the monoamine vesicular transporters. What that means is it's actively transported into neurons, it's actually transported into synaptic vesicles. Again, you'd expect this for an endogenous neuromodulator, of course. The lucidity of the experience. Terence McKenna used to say, in a funny kind of way, it doesn't affect the mind because you're kind of astonished, but you're completely clear-headed. So you would expect this. You wouldn't expect peripheral effects that cloud the experience if it actually, DMT in the brain had co-evolved for the brain to actually construct this reality. And finally, there is what I've termed a vestigial psychedelic secretion in the human brain. So currently the brain, as far as we know, doesn't secrete psychedelic concentrations of DMT, but I propose that it did. And that in fact has been some sort of decline in neural function where DMT is now only an ancestral neuromodulator. And so when you smoke DMT, you're actually reconstituting an ancestral function of DMT. So I'll quit the summary and I'll say thank you very much for listening.
Questions for members, please. There's a lot. Let's keep going back and forth across. Rupert.
Well, it's very provocative.
Thank you.
Can I just ask how ancestral you think this ancestor was? Do you think monkeys, for example, have DMT-type dreams?
Very good question. I mean, okay, well, my suggestion, I don't really have an exact time frame. My suggestion would be, well, I guess we often sort of banded around figures sort of 50,000 years or something like that. What's interesting, if I can slightly digress a little bit, people always talk about the pineal gland and DMT. There has been a suggestion that the pineal gland secretes DMT. Again, there's no actual evidence for that. But what is interesting is that melatonin, which is secreted by the pineal gland, is a tryptamine. So it wouldn't take much of a mutation to go from DMT secretion and melatonin secretion. Melatonin also has a very different function. But melatonin secretion is triggered by darkness. Now, according to my model, DMT production will be triggered at night time. It's also interesting when you look at some of the Upper Paleolithic rock art. One of the great mysteries is, well, first of all, why are they drawing or painting these images of half man and half beast, or these strange creatures that don't seem to be of this earth? People have suggested, well, perhaps they were on psychedelic drugs, and that's certainly possible. I think it may have been an endogenous psychedelic drug. One of the great or strange things about this rock art is it's often deep, deep underground, completely inaccessible and in complete darkness. That's kind of a mystery. Why would you do that? Why would you take a psychedelic drug and then go into complete darkness? But if, in fact, what was going on is they were going to complete darkness in order to, as a kind of an early way of stimulating DMT production, then that would explain why you go to somewhere where there's complete pitch black, because then it would trigger DMT production in the brain. So that's just one idea. So there could be evidence in rock art. That's my answer.
I guess you could consider the brain as an evolved organ, evolved by Darwin in evolution to facilitate our survival. And so normal consensus reality is one in which we have the ability to sense danger, predators, food supplies, and a mate. But what would you regard the DMT world to be in terms of survival usefulness?
Well, clearly, if I'm correct, then the brain has subsequently lost this ability. So it obviously wasn't, well, not say that important, but humans are pretty unique. In fact, the Royal Standard Study is discussing DMT right now. It's always a testament to our creativity and our powers of insight. So perhaps, I'm not sure, but DMT may have been responsible. It could have been a mutation that allowed the brain to secrete DMT that gave humans our kind of special powers.
But where do the elves come into survival?
Well, I'm not saying necessarily. Well, I mean, if DMT is allowing the brain to receive data from an alien reality, then you don't get to choose who's there. So if elves are there, I mean, I'm not 100% convinced that you are actually seeing, or that the brain is receiving any data, whether this is some sort of some kind of unconscious world, I guess. It's impossible to say. Certainly the parallels between experiences suggest that it isn't unconscious data, suggest there is an extrinsic component, because otherwise you'd expect very different experiences. But really, when you get to the very high doses, the experiences are very disturbingly uniform, unnervingly so, I think.
Do you think there might be any possibility for an intrinsic within the brain, a neurological explanation as to why the intrinsic firing patterns under DMT converge so much? Or do you think that it has to be outside the brain, that it has to be from somewhere else?
Well, I can't see any reason why the intrinsic activity would construct hyper-technological alien realities as a default in the presence of DMT, or why the brain could shift. So no, I don't. I mean, I'm not against the idea that perhaps there is a part of the brain or a part of the unconscious that is actually perhaps evolving in parallel and we're completely unaware of it. Jung spoke about autonomous complexes. Perhaps the DMT reality is actually evolving in all of us all the time and we never even notice it, so it's completely autonomous. And in fact, it may be evolving even at a much greater rate than we are. Maybe it's not subject to the same constraints. We know that different organisms evolve at different rates, and perhaps this world is evolving, and maybe it only starts evolving when you're born, but by the time you reach the age at which you might consider smoking DMT, it's already progressed to this hyper-technological stage. I don't know, it's such a fascinating topic to speculate about.
Are you suggesting that there might be a correlation between this effect and reported alien encounters?
Again, it has been suggested by a number of people. I'm not 100% convinced. I mean, first of all, we have to note there's no evidence that DMT is kind of wrapped up during these alien encounter experiences, but I'm not convinced that they are the same. People, really, what happens on a DMT, as I say, is complete replacement of consensus reality. It's not like you get elements of the DMT reality in yours. You don't see aliens come into the bedroom. You are, for all intents and purposes, to anyone watching you, you are not there. You're asleep, but it's all raging on inside.
Actually, that was my question as well, that that molecule produces that specific effect. Could it be that a natural production in some kind of brain dysfunction could lead to that sort of experience?
Possibly. I mean, that was in the kind of in the 60s and 70s, people did look at schizophrenic patients and they thought maybe they have some sort of aberrant overproduction of DMT in the brain, but they found that actually schizophrenics and normal people, if you like, have very similar levels. There's no correlation between psychosis and DMT levels in the brain.
I wondered if you think it's a possibility that DMT is stimulating the storytelling centre of the brain in creating a story world, and therefore isn't necessarily ancestral, but still with us today in the creative arts, where people are creating stories all the time. Because it seemed to me that the conscious I is there, present, as it is in dreaming consciousness. And dreaming consciousness itself is creating a whole different types of narratives and story worlds. And this particular, I don't know what DMT is, but seems to create one particular type of story world, which I find fascinating. Do you think there's a possibility that there are other drugs out there, or whatever things to take, that create another story world for us, or can we uncover that for us?
I think it's certainly possible. I think it's possible that perhaps the brain's capable of experiencing a whole range of parallel. I mean, my theory, or my idea really focuses on the idea that the brain had to somehow evolve this ability to construct this other reality. And using this diurnal cycling model is the simplest way, and that of course involves two molecules, one for the night and one for the day. You'd have to adapt that idea to suggest that the brain would be able to tune in to other realities. I think you'd have to adapt that model, I think.
Last question.
Have any experiments been done with people from very, very different cultures